Don't be sloppy when setting your boundaries because you will pay for it in the end. 5 mistakes people make when setting their boundaries. So, believe it or not, even as a therapist, I have to have boundaries even with my client. And the reason why is because I want to make sure that I'm giving my all to them, but within certain parameters. Because if I truly gave my all to them without any parameters, I would suffer in my relationship. I would suffer in my personal life. And honestly, I would suffer even in my own business. Because if I gave all of my time, all of my efforts to, let's say, one client, well, let's say 3 out of the, let's say 20 clients that I have, I would be doing a disservice to the other 17 clients. So as a result, I have to have boundaries amongst my client. I'll actually tell you a real life boundary that I currently have with my clients, and I've been holding strong to it for the past couple of years. So one thing that I used to have problems with was charging my clients whenever they missed a session. And the reason why is because I didn't want them to feel like I was out to get them or make their lives difficult or that I wasn't reasonable. Because when the relationship between the therapist and the client is damaged, it's hard for the client to receive the information that the therapist is now giving them. So think about it. You need to see me, if you're a client of mine, you need to see me as a friend and not a foe. And whenever someone feels like the therapist or the friend is charging them without giving them a service, they may feel like, man, they're really hurting my pockets, or they're not being fair. And that used to be something that I struggled with. And as a result, I would let people cancel last minute and I would not get paid for that session. So essentially, I would just lose that hour of my day and also the income that came from that session, which obviously I used to feed my family, keep the roof over my head, right? Things like that. So I had to one day get real honest with myself. And this is where the abundance mindset had to come in for me. I had to tell myself the right client will not only pay the late fee or the cancellation fee, but they would do so happily. And as a result, I would also have multiple clients after this client if they decide to not pay and they don't want to see me again, right? Because that has happened. Because I had to instill that belief within myself, I had other clients, right? New clients come and take the seats of the clients who left. And as a result, I had a client caseload full of ideal clients. What's even crazy is one day I had a client tell me, hey coach, I'm actually going to miss our session today because I had something come up, but please still charge me. And I was like, whoa, like this client knows that, hey, my time is valuable and they respect it. And because of that, they decided to go ahead and pay me for my time, even though I wasn't spending it directly with them. And since then, I've instilled that boundary within my clients and even within myself that if someone were to cancel last minute, I would still charge them a no-show fee. And that has led me to have clients that value my time. And also my personal income isn't attacked, if you will, when they don't show up. So boundaries are something that everyone, even myself, have to instill. And they're important because boundary actually leads you to having more happiness and peace in your life. Someone that doesn't have boundaries is someone that is constantly stressed and overwhelmed because they're people pleasing or they're not simply valuing themselves. And that is a surefire recipe for depression, feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and things like that. So in this podcast, I'm talking about 5 mistakes that you need to avoid when setting boundaries. And before I get to the first one, make sure you subscribe to this channel because I give you guys free, valuable gems just like this that I would give in a therapy session. So if you've never been to a therapy session, I want you to imagine that this is your first time because this is what it's going to feel like. Now, this doesn't replace therapy, but the information that I'm giving you is very similar to the information that I would give if someone was in my office for therapy. So with that being said, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and let's get to episode, or rather point number 1. Mistake number 1 that I see people make when setting boundaries is that they tend to put the responsibility of that boundary on others rather than putting the responsibility on them. Now, here's the thing, guys. When you set up a boundary, it is not their job to follow it. It is your job to take action when they don't follow it. Therefore, the power always stays within your side of the court. Because a lot of people, what they'll say to me in a therapy session or even just in regular conversations is that they didn't respect my boundary. And I'm like, well, what happened when they didn't respect your boundary? What did you do? And that always needs to be the question that you need to ask yourself. Like, what is it that you did? What is it that you're going to do when they do not respect this boundary. Because if you're still taking the same actions as before, letting it slide, then trust me, they're going to keep crossing that boundary again and again and again because there is no consequence that follows. Guys, trust me, people will do what they want when they want so long as they're able to get away with it. And what I need you to do is actually take ownership of these issues, of these boundaries that you're setting. You know, I really love the word responsibility, and I'm going to give you a new definition of it. A definition that comes from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. So Stephen Covey says that your responsibility is your ability to respond. And what I want you to ask yourself, do you have a high ability to respond when someone crosses your boundary? If you can say yes, then you will be someone that has a lot of happiness and peace in their life because you're good at setting boundaries. Just like I was very good or became very good at setting the boundary of charging my clients when they don't show up for sessions, right? I need you to be that same level of commitment. So your responsibility, it falls on you, not the other person. That is the first mistake that I see people make when setting boundaries. Main point number 2, and I actually got this when I was actually working at the Boys and Girls Club back in my earlier years when I was in college. So what was interesting when I worked with kids is that I knew that if I came with the same level of, let's say, consequences, or if I spoke at the same level of tone, if I treated the students all the same, even when I'm upset, I knew that I wouldn't have to struggle in the future when I needed to get them to do something. So I'll give you an idea. So in the first day of having our students, I remember telling myself that I'm gonna have a rule. My rule is that I will not yell at the kids whenever they're messing up. I'm gonna speak to them as calmly as I am like this whenever they're messing up and I need them to do something. Because what kids would do is that they would test you. They'll wait to see how serious you are when you're giving them an instruction, when you're telling them something to do. So I told myself, hey, I'm gonna speak to them calm and I'm gonna tell them one time, hey, I need you to get in line. And if they didn't get in line, what I would do is I would take all the other kids that decided to get in line and we would leave the playground or we would leave the gym. And when that other kid saw that we were leaving and they were coming along in the back, I would tell them, hey, you now have to go to timeout because you didn't come when I asked. And because I was consistent on day 1, later down the line, right, later in the year, when I needed to tell them to do something, they knew that when I said it, I meant it. And I didn't need to go to level 10 to get them to listen to what I was saying. That is what being consistent with your boundaries look like, and that is what it would do for you. Because if you're consistent day 1, it makes it easier when you're on day 99 when you're trying to enforce this boundary. But if you've been wishy-washy for the past 98 days, it's going to be hard on the 99th day for someone to take you serious just because you're saying something with a lot more tone in your voice, or you're angry this time and you're trying to, get them to listen to you or respect the boundary. No, day 1, you need to start being consistent with what it is that you need them to do and the consequences that you're going to follow up with. All right. Now, something I'm going to talk about in the next point, and as a matter of fact, we'll go ahead and jump into the next point. When you're being consistent with your boundaries, I also need you to be clear on what those boundaries is. So that's point number 3. That's the third mistake that people make, is that they're not being clear on what the boundary is. Now, one thing that I tell my clients is to use this framework whenever they need to be direct with people. And it's called PRE. All right, so PRE. And what it stands for is point, reason, example. So what you want to do is you want to state your point for the boundary. So what is it, right? That boundary may be, when I come home from work at 6, I need at least until 6:30 to gather myself, right? So just 30 minutes, right? So one may give that point, and then what they need to follow up with is the word because. Because typically I'm working long hours. I'm working 11 hours, and when I come home, I'm beat. I've also been in traffic for an hour, so I'm just tired. And if I'm not able to have that rest, I'm gonna be a little cranky. I won't be the best husband or wife that you need me to be, right? So that's the because part, right? That's the reason. And then what you can do is you can give the example, or what I like to call the story. So you will give the story of a time where you didn't have that rest, you didn't have that alone time, and you ended up getting into a big fight with your wife or your husband or whoever, right? Like that's how you can point it. That's how you can get your point across when you're speaking to your loved one or whoever it is that you need to set this boundary with. So again, point, reason, example, PRE. So state your point, tell the reason why the point is important, and then give a story that solidifies that point that you initially made. That is a great way to be direct, to be clear. Now, also what I tell my clients is that when they tell someone that they need something, right? So some of my clients may go to their wives and they may ask them, how can I be there for you? And their wife may say, I just need you to be more supportive. And what I tell my guys to do is to ask their wives, what does supportive look like? Because supportive is an umbrella, just like love, caring, support, right? Intimacy, like those are umbrella or broad terms. And what I need them to do is actually ask, what does that look like? Because what she may think supportiveness looks like may be totally different from what he thinks supportiveness looks like. And this is so true when you're setting boundaries. So when you set your boundary, make sure you tell them exactly what it looks like. Make sure that you're being clear. And with the previous point, make sure you're being consistent on that clarity. Mistake number 4 that clients make when they're trying to set their boundaries is that they typically ignore their own needs. So what I mean by this is that people typically set boundaries that they feel that the other person would follow, but yet at the same time, it's still not addressing their specific needs. So what I may mean by this is that guy who may say, hey, I need 30 minutes after work, what he may be telling himself is that 30 minutes is just enough to where I don't get into a fight, right? Just enough to where, she's not going to be able, or she's not going to, jump down my throat or feel like I'm not showing her love or support or things like that. But in actuality, you may actually need more than that. You may actually need an hour or so. And what I want you to do is actually I want you to feel confident enough that you can actually go to your wife, your loved one, or whoever it is, and ask them for exactly what it is that you need. And this again goes back to being clear. But the reason why people ignore their own needs is that they have this fear of rejection. They have the fear of getting someone upset. And then also they have a fear of being guilty. These 3 things really stop people from going all in when it comes to setting their boundaries. So what they may do is set a boundary that may be small or maybe a little bit more or a little less significant than what they really truly need. And what they're going to do is they're going to end up finding that they're going to have resentment when that person is just again and again and again not following that boundary that they originally set. So what I need you to do is to feel confident. I need you to feel okay. And also, I need you to invest in these relationships. Now, what do I mean by this? So there's a concept that I went over with my clients and even in my newsletter, which you should subscribe to. All you gotta do is click the link in the bio. I went over a concept called the emotional bank account. And what this looks like is that it's very similar to a regular bank account, right? Where if you put $100 in, you could take $100 out. But if you put $100 in and you try to take $1,000 out, you're gonna get an error message. And that is what's happening when people are trying to set boundaries. They try to set the boundaries and they're getting these error messages. And what this looks like is when someone isn't emotionally depositing into their relationships, what's going to happen is that when they set a boundary, the loved one or whoever it is, they may not respect it. They may feel like, you're being selfish, if you will, because you're not putting other investments or time into the relationship. So what an emotional bank account really is the trust and goodwill that you have with someone. So if I'm constantly showing small gestures of kindness to, let's say, my wife, if I'm constantly being apologetic or being open to feedback, but nonetheless, if you're making these deposits into your relationships, you will find that when you go to make a withdrawal, such as, hey, I need an hour of free time after work versus 30 minutes, your spouse, your coworkers, your customers, they're going to say, hey, that's fine. Right? So I want you guys to invest into your relationships. And what I'll do is I'll actually, in the bottom of this episode, you can look down below, you'll actually see that I've listed a few more ways to emotionally deposit into your emotional bank account. Okay, so my apologies for not having more, but there's definitely a lot more that you can do. Main point number 5, one of the best ways, if not the best way, to make sure that you're not making mistakes when you're setting boundaries is to make sure that you're not coming off as aggressive when you're setting boundaries. So for a lot of people, they may see setting boundaries as something that you have to do when you're angry or upset, or you have to have a stern voice when you're doing this. Something similar to being like a drill sergeant, if you will. And that is not the case. Actually, You will lose the people that you love and that you care about when you try to set boundaries in that way. All right. So what I want you to do to overcome this mistake is to use positive language. Okay. Use positive language whenever you're trying to set a boundary. An example of positive language would be you saying something like, I need quiet time to focus on my work, instead of saying something like, stop bothering me while I'm working. Do you see the difference between the two? One is definitely more positive and the other one is more negative, like the tone that you're using, if you will. So what I want you to do is focus on using a positive way of saying your message. It's not that we're not being clear or we're not being specific, but we want to make sure that we're being positive when we're saying the things or the boundaries that we're trying to set. Also, what you can say is that you can use rather is I statements. I statements have always been big. When you do that, you're placing all of the reasons on you as to why you need this boundary. It's not that they did something wrong, even though they may have. But what we want to do is we want to take full responsibility for this boundary and say that this is how I feel, or this is what I need, if you will, thus leaving the person intact, if you will, and not feeling like they have to be defensive or get defensive when you're setting this boundary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize the 5 main points that I just made in order to make sure you're not making mistakes when you're setting boundaries. So the first one, as I stated, was that make sure you put in the responsibility on you when it comes to the boundaries, not the other people. So whenever they cross a boundary, make sure you follow up with the actions that you're going to take. Don't tell yourself that, hey, they should have done X, Y, Z, because people will do what they want to do. Make sure that you know exactly what you're going to do when they cross this boundary. Second, I need you to be consistent, because a big mistake that people make is that they're inconsistent when they follow through with their boundaries. And again, I want you guys to make sure that you're being clear on what it is that you mean, what you're meaning when you're being consistent. And that's actually step number 4, right? Or step number 3, I'm sorry. So a big mistake people are making is not being clear on what the boundary is. Make sure you use the pre-framework that I mentioned: point, reason, example. And then fourth, make sure you're not ignoring your own needs, right? And I want you guys to make sure that you're not feeling guilty, you're not feeling bad or anything like that when you're setting this boundary. And to avoid that, you need to make sure that you're emotionally depositing into your relationships, okay? And this is where I talked about the bank account. And again, I will put something in the comments below, in the description below, so that you can get more examples of how to do that. And then mistake number 5 is people typically come off as aggressive when they're setting boundaries. And this prevents people from hearing what it is that you're actually saying, because the only thing that they can focus on is the tone that you're using when you're setting boundaries. So make sure that you're using positive language or even I statements when you're setting boundaries. So this is Coach Wells, and thank you for checking out this podcast. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button.